people go mad when reading the Necronomicon. I think I may have read some of it myself sometime or other, you know. Anyway, just a fake book lending a kind of miasma to Lovecraft's mythos, yeah.
No, sadly, the copy of the Necronomicon that I might have had access to, that was at Bicester University, now one of the students actually got into the rare bookcase and destroyed everything, including the Revelations of Glarkey, so I don't even have that. So what can we do, guys? We just go and search around the second-hand booksellers, because it's out there somewhere, or on the internet, and one day we're going to find it, and maybe we wish we never had.
At the end of the day, the Necronomicon... The Necronomicon is a thing that lives in idea space. That's what it is. That's what makes it cool.
Experiences taught the remnants of the American people what they never thought of when the first idealists opened the gates to scum. That there is no such thing as the assimilation of a stock whose relation to our own history is so slight.
Lovecraft himself adopted these views at a very early age, at an age far earlier than he could have gained them from reading books or anything of the sort. So that's why family influence has to be the nucleus of these views. And subsequently, he did read a lot of the racist tracts that were written. They were actually a lot of them being written at that time, because these old Americans were very afraid or threatened by an enormous influx of immigration that was coming in, basically from 1890 to 1920. It has often been said, oh, well, how can Lovecraft be a racist when he married a Jewish woman? Well, the fact of the matter is that what Lovecraft believed was that immigrants, whether they be Jewish or Spanish or whoever, should renounce their own cultural heritage and adopt that of the Native Americans. And he felt that his wife, Sonia, had done that she had become a kind of honorary Anglo-Saxon.
Yours of the 15th found me completely knocked out with grip. Don't know how long or serious an ordeal I'm in for, but Dr. Dustin plans to call on a stomach specialist Tuesday. Am in constant pain, take only liquid food, spend all time in chair propped with pillows, and can read and write only a few minutes at a time.
In 1934, he starts complaining of indigestion, of serious bout of indigestion. Later on, he says he had grip, which was simply an old-fashioned term for the flu, but it affected his whole metabolism. His death certificate, I believe, records 2 causes of death: Bright's disease, which is a disease of the kidneys, and also cancer of the small intestine. Now, cancer of the small intestine is relatively rare. Colon cancer is much more common. And of course, at that time, the treatment of cancer was at a relatively primitive stage. My feeling is that, on the whole, Lovecraft's very poor diet caused his cancer, and we can see it coming on years and years before.
Don Walheim, I met him in Frankfurt. He was going to publish The Burrows Beneath. And we sat having a meal at the Frankfurt Book Messe. I was in the army at the time. This would be the late 60s anyway, I think. And he said to me, when were you born anyway, Brian? He said, I think I read something in one of the Arkham House books about your birth date that interested me. And I said, I was born on the 2nd of December, 1937. He said, yeah, you realize that was 9 months after Lovecraft died? And I said, oh, yeah, I suppose it was. He said, yeah. And of course, sure enough, when The Burrows Beneath was published by Daw and the transition to Tighter Scroll, I had inherited the mantle of Lovecraft, and there I was. Lumley makes nothing of it himself, but the fact is he was born 9 months after Lovecraft died, you know. And I've been criticized for that. I've been criticized for being born, apparently, you know.
During Lovecraft's lifetime, only one attempt had been made to publish his work in a bound format. An error-ridden version of The Shadow of Innsmouth had a small run of a mere 200 copies, and left the publisher borrowing money from Lovecraft in order to survive. Shortly after his death in 1937, 2 of Lovecraft's friends through correspondence, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, formed a small press publishing company affectionately named Arkham House, after Lovecraft's mythical Massachusetts town. In 1939, they released The Outsider and Others, the first in a series of Lovecraft collections. Arkham House has continued to publish pioneering works of weird fiction for over 60 years. Run now by Derleth's descendants, it is still based out of a residential home in Sauk City, Wisconsin.
Derleth impressed me tremendously, favorably, from the moment I began to hear from him personally. I saw that he had a prodigious fund of activity and reserve mental energy, and that it would only be a question of time before he began to correlate it to real aesthetic advantage.
First of all, I have to say that I'm immensely grateful to August Derleth. He was my first publisher. He was also, even more importantly, my first editor. He was the guy who told me how to do it and gave me lots of editorial advice. So, I'm extremely grateful to him. But at the same time, I think we have to be objective about, how he handled Lovecraft. There are two separate things here. First of all, he certainly did bring Lovecraft into hardcover when that needed to be done. I don't think that if Derleth had not done it, nobody else would have. I'm sure that eventually Lovecraft would have seen hardcover and his fame would have spread. Nevertheless, we have to accept it was Derleth who did do it, and we can't change history. I think I have more reservations about the way that he used Lovecraft's mythos in his own stories, which is to say, basically, he Christianized the mythos.
And that's what makes August Derleth's revision of the Cthulhu mythos into a sort of naive battle between good entities and bad entities or evil entities particularly egregious, because that contradicts the fundamental aspect of Lovecraft's very bleak and cold vision.
But I appreciate their point of view, which is that he sidetracked the mythos in a direction different to that which Lovecraft would have chosen. Well, I don't think anybody who comes to it can help but sidetrack it into their direction if they're going to write in that genre or subgenre. Of course they're going to write it from their point of view. Derleth, in fact, was probably the savior, certainly was the savior of Lovecraft's ephemera, the stuff at the side that wasn't vastly important, wouldn't have been published. But for Derleth, he saved this stuff from the pages of weird... How many weird tales authors have carried on into the... very few. Most of them have sunk into the little vacuum that takes all authors in the end. But Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard have floated. And the reason they've floated is because their stories were gathered together and published by Arkham House. And Derleth was responsible, of course, for Arkham House. He knew a good story when he saw one.
On the other hand, it's probably worth remembering that, Frank Belknap Long, back in the Space Eaters, he has a glowing cross which appears and drives off the creatures from space. And Lovecraft certainly read that story, and there's no record that he objected to this Christian symbol being brought into the midst of what he was doing. Now, one suspects he wasn't very happy about it, and very possibly he just didn't want to upset his friend, old Frank, or his nephew, as he called him. But so, in a way, Lovecraft had his chance to make absolutely clear he didn't want people putting Christianity into his mythos, and he didn't. So you can't entirely blame Derleth for, in a sense, following, along lines that had already been, at the very least, hinted at.
They blame him for diverting Lovecraft's mythos. Well, it may have been diverted, but it hasn't stagnated. That's the point. Yeah.
I imitated Lovecraft far too closely and far too slavishly when I started seriously writing horror fiction. That's to say, I imitated the bits that looked easiest to imitate, and sadly that's the mistake that far too many people make. So, I took the baggage of the Lovecraft mythology and added a couple of monsters to it, and certainly I imitated, sadly, the thing that people often think is the core of Lovecraft, which is, the elaborate adjectival prose. And what we tend to forget is that wasn't by any means all there was to Lovecraft's style. A lot of it is very sober, very gradual, very documentary. It's only very gradually that it slips into this delirious quality as it becomes more and more apparent that, the story can't quite explain away everything that it's talking about. And the other real problem as well, and I've always felt very guilty about this, is that what I did basically was I filled in the gaps.